A flight attendant laughed at a black mother's accent in front of her child. 5 minutes later, she was pulled from duty and walked off the plane. But what happened after that shocked everyone, even the airline. Before we start the story, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. "You talk funny," sneered the flight attendant, chuckling as she waved her hand in front of her face like she was swatting away a joke. Her name tag read Courtney, and she wasn't even trying to hide her smirk. The woman standing in front of her, clutching a boarding pass in one hand and her daughter's small backpack in the other, blinked twice. Danielle had only asked for help finding their seats. Her voice carried the smooth rhythm of the Deep South, rich, proud, and calm. But instead of helping, Courtney laughed. "Lord, I can't understand a word you're saying," she added, loud enough for several passengers nearby to glance up from their phones and magazines. Danielle didn't respond. Her 7-year-old daughter, Jayla, looked up at her. Confused, "Mommy, did she say you talk funny?" she whispered. Danielle gently squeezed her hand. "Let's go sit, baby," she said quietly. They found their seats, but A and 2B in first class, and settled in without another word. But the tension hung thick in the air. Courtney strutted down the aisle as if she'd just said something clever. No apology, no sense of shame, just a sense of entitlement wrapped in a uniform. Jayla sat by the window, swinging her legs and hugging her stuffed bear. Danielle stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. She had flown hundreds of times before and had learned long ago not to give people like Courtney the satisfaction of a reaction, but that didn't mean she would let it go. Danielle wasn't on this flight by chance. She had been invited to Washington, D.C. to accept an award for her work in language development in underfunded communities. She was a speech specialist with a Ph.D. in phonetics and had spent the last decade helping children speak with confidence, no matter where they were from or how their voices sounded. Her accent was part of her identity, not a flaw. And now on a plane filled with strangers, her voice had been turned into a punchline. Courtney returned 10 minutes later with the drink cart still riding the high of her earlier joke. She turned to Danielle and smiled wide, her voice soaked in sarcasm. "Would you like some water or maybe some iced tea, sweetie?" The mocking was worse this time. She was performing now. A couple sitting across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jayla looked at her mother again. "Why is she talking like that?" she asked. Danielle didn't say a word, but someone else heard everything. Laura, seated in one seat, closed her laptop slowly and leaned back in her chair. She had watched the entire interaction from the moment Danielle stepped onto the plane. She had also seen the disrespect, the ridicule, and the discomfort spreading across the cabin. Laura wasn't just another traveler. She worked high up in the airline's corporate division in the Department of Guest Experience, and she had booked this flight under her personal account, traveling anonymously to assess in-flight service for an internal report. What Courtney didn't know was that her mockery had just become a career-ending mistake. The clock was ticking, and in less than 5 minutes, everything was about to change. Courtney moved down the aisle, unaware that her every word had just lit a fire that wouldn't die quietly. She poured orange juice for a businessman in 3A without even glancing back at Danielle or her daughter. Her laugh still echoed faintly as she joked with another attendant about thick accents and how she needed subtitles next time. Laura, still in 1C, watched all of it, every whisper, every smirk, every eye roll. She didn't say a word yet. She just reached into her carry-on, took out a small notepad, and began writing, neatly, calmly, purposefully. Meanwhile, Jayla leaned against her mom's arm, clearly unsettled. "Why did she say you talk funny?" "You don't sound funny to me," she said in a quiet voice. Danielle gave her a soft smile. "Some people laugh at things they don't understand, baby. That says more about them than it does about us." 2 rows behind them, Grant, a middle-aged man in a business suit, leaned forward. He had overheard everything but hadn't said a word. Now he cleared his throat and said to no one in particular, "You know, some folks just need to grow up, acting like middle school bullies at 3,000 feet. His comment drew a short, nervous chuckle from another passenger, but no one replied. The mood shifted. A few passengers started whispering quietly, side eyes passing from seat to seat. People had definitely noticed Courtney, still unaware of the trouble building around her, continued her routine as if nothing had happened. She was too confident, too used to brushing things off. Back up front, Laura stood and walked briskly to the cockpit area, where two flight attendants were restocking cups and snacks. She asked to speak to the lead flight supervisor. Privately, she added, her voice firm. Within a minute, Thomas, the flight service manager on board, met her in the galley. "Mom, is everything all right?" he asked politely. Laura pulled out her airline badge from her wallet and handed it to him. His eyes widened slightly as he read her title. She didn't give him time to react. "I've just witnessed 2 separate incidents of passenger mockery and verbal misconduct by your staff. One of them is named Courtney. I need a statement from her immediately, and you're going to stay by my side until this is handled." Thomas nodded stiffly. He didn't argue. He had seen enough to know something serious had just landed in his lap. What had started as a casual flight to Washington was now about to become a PR disaster, and Courtney had no idea the storm she was about to walk into. Thomas stepped back slightly, still holding Laura's ID as if it were burning his hands. He glanced down the aisle toward the drink cart where Courtney was laughing with a passenger completely unaware of what had just unfolded. Laura crossed her arms and spoke in a voice that was calm but left no room for misunderstanding. "I need her pulled from the service rotation right now. No argument, no delay. You can either walk her back here professionally or I'll make the call myself and have her met at the gate. Your choice." There was a pause, tight and heavy, before Thomas nodded once, "Yes, Mom." He tucked the badge into his shirt pocket for safety and turned to call over a nearby crew member. Within moments, Courtney was called to the front under the pretense of needing to help with a passenger query. She arrived still smiling, still oblivious, adjusting her ponytail and wiping her hands on a napkin. "What's up?" she asked casually. Laura didn't waste time. "You've been recorded mocking a passenger twice. The woman in 2A. Your tone, your words, and your behavior were unacceptable. I'm not a passenger. I'm an executive with the airline. And you've just disrespected not only a paying customer, but our brand and everything we stand for." Courtney blinked, still not fully grasping the situation. "Wait, what? I was just being friendly." She took it the wrong way. "I didn't mean anything by it." Laura leaned in slightly. "That woman you laughed at is a nationally recognized speech specialist. She teaches children how to find pride in their voices, and your first instinct was to humiliate her in front of her child, no less. You don't get to hide behind, 'I was just joking.' This isn't middle school Courtney's." Face drained of color. Her smile faded instantly. I didn't know who she was." "It doesn't matter who she was," Laura snapped. "You treat everyone with respect. You should have known better the moment you put that uniform on." Just a few feet away, Thomas looked deeply uncomfortable but said nothing. The silence was filled by the muffled hum of the engines and distant passenger chatter. Laura continued, "You are now being removed from duty. We will continue this discussion after landing. But make no mistake, you're not working another flight for this airline until this matter is fully reviewed. You will not speak to the passenger again. Do you understand me?" Courtney opened her mouth like she might protest, then closed it again. "Yes," she muttered, eyes lowered. Laura turned to Thomas. "Have her take a passenger seat at the back. No interaction with anyone, and make sure ground operations is alerted before we land." Thomas nodded quickly and escorted Courtney away. She walked slowly, as if her shoes suddenly weighed too much. As she passed row 2, Danielle didn't look at her. Jayla, however, did. A short, curious glance from a little girl who didn't understand everything, but knew enough to see when someone had been caught doing wrong. Danielle gently brushed her daughter's hair behind her ear. "You okay, baby?" she asked softly. Jayla nodded. "Is that lady in trouble?" Danielle smiled faintly. "She will be." What Courtney failed to see, what she never even considered, was that Danielle didn't need to yell or record or make a scene. She didn't need to argue or beg anyone to care. Her dignity was enough, and someone had seen that dignity. Someone with the power to do something about it. But what neither Danielle nor Courtney knew yet was that the fallout from this flight wasn't just going to be disciplinary. It was going to be national, because by the time this plane touched down, word was already spreading, and things were about to get much bigger than either of them ever imagined. The rest of the cabin settled into an odd quiet, the kind that only happens when people feel something important is happening, but don't know exactly what. A few passengers noticed Courtney being moved toward the back, escorted like a child sent to detention. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't meet any eyes, and for the first time since she'd boarded that morning, the smirk was gone. Her cheeks were blotchy, her steps uncertain. She took an empty seat near the very back of the plane next to the bathroom, far from the polished ease of the first-class cabin where the insult had begun. Up front, Thomas returned to his jump seat, fidgeting nervously with his tie. Laura remained standing for a moment, steadying her thoughts. She wasn't just acting in defense of a single passenger. She was thinking about every person who'd ever been talked down to because of how they spoke, how they looked, or where they came from. She knew this wasn't a small issue. It was part of a bigger pattern, and it had just unfolded on her watch. Quietly, she pulled out her tablet and began typing her preliminary report. Her fingers moving fast and firm on the screen. Danielle sat still in her seat. She hadn't looked back, hadn't asked questions, hadn't demanded an apology. She had simply stayed composed, but inside her heart beat heavy, not from anger but from exhaustion. This wasn't the first time someone mocked her accent. She had faced it in college and faculty meetings, even at conferences where she was the keynote speaker. Always the same look, like she wasn't polished enough, like she didn't sound smart enough. Never mind the diplomas on her wall or the research papers with her name in bold. Some people only needed to hear a few syllables to make their decision, but today had felt different. Maybe because her daughter had witnessed it, maybe because she was too tired to swallow it quietly again. Jayla leaned into her mom's shoulder and whispered, "Did that lady lose her job?" Danielle hesitated. "I don't know yet." Sweetie, Jayla frowned. "She should say sorry to you and to me too." Danielle smiled softly but didn't reply. She knew better than to expect real apologies from people like Courtney. They always seemed shocked when called out, confused when corrected, as if consequences were brand new. What mattered now wasn't the apology, it was the action that followed. And from the way things were moving, she could tell that action had already begun. 2 rows back, Grant leaned to his seatmate and whispered, "That was the same flight attendant. Right, the one making jokes." His seatmate, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses, nodded slowly. "Yeah, mocking that woman's voice." "I heard it too. You think she's getting fired? I think she's lucky this didn't go viral." Yeah, but that assumption was already wrong. In row 5C, a college student named Riley had caught most of it on video. Not the first mocking comment, but the second one, when Courtney had faked the accent while serving drinks and the quiet discomfort spread across the cabin. Riley hadn't posted anything yet. She was still editing the clip, adding subtitles, making sure it was clear. The title she typed above the video said, "Flight attendant laughs at black woman's accent and regrets it fast." She added 3 hashtags, disrespect in the skies, accent is not a fault, and accountability matters. Then she hit upload. In less than 10 minutes, the post reached 2,000 views. In 20, it crossed 10,000 comments began pouring. In angry shock, supportive people shared their own stories of being laughed at for how they spoke, how they pronounced words, how they carried the sounds of their families and hometowns in every sentence. Some of the comments read, "She handled that with so much grace, I would have lost it. This woman needs to sue the airline. This is disgusting. My grandma spoke like that. She was the smartest woman I knew." Meanwhile, the airline's internal systems lit up as alerts from social media, monitoring tools triggered red flags. A manager in the corporate PR department flagged the video within minutes. The name of the flight, the time, and the staff list began circulating internally. Laura's name popped up quickly, so did Courtney's back in the cabin. Danielle remained unaware of the growing digital storm. She had no idea her quiet dignity had just become the center of a conversation. Bigger than the airplane, bigger than Courtney's behavior. She was part of something larger now, something louder. At that moment, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Washington in approximately 25 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are stowed." Passengers shifted in their seats, putting away books and electronics. But the energy in the cabin was different. "Now charged alert. Courtney stayed glued to her seat in the back, her posture stiff. She checked her phone discreetly, saw the missed messages from crew chat, saw the rising tension in the crew members around her. Her hands shook slightly as she scrolled. Then she saw it. Her name, the video, the hashtags. Her stomach sank. Reality was catching up fast, and it wasn't going to wait for landing. Courtney's fingers hovered above her screen as her eyes darted across the growing number of views on the video. The thumbnail was unmistakable, her face mid-sentence captured while mocking Danielle's voice. She clicked on it, hoping it had been taken out of context. But there it was, her exaggerated tone, the forced southern drawl, the awkward silence afterward. The little girl asking, "Why is she talking like that?" All of it captured clearly, with subtitles and commentary already flooding in. She refreshed the page. 28,000 views, 200 comments. Then more. One read, "Fired in 543. Another, this woman better not represent any airline I fly with." Absolutely shameful a knot formed in her stomach. She hadn't thought it would go this far. She'd made jokes like that before. Some passengers laughed, a few rolled their eyes, sure, but no one ever said anything. But today someone did, and now thousands of people were saying something all at once. At the front of the plane, Laura had already received 3 emails from corporate, one from public relations, one from HR, and one directly from the vice president of operations. All of them were asking the same question. Is this real, and is this Courtney from Flight 736? Her fingers moved quickly over her tablet, confirming everything they needed to know. Yes, it was real, and yes, this wasn't just some passenger incident. They were dealing with a viral scandal that could cost the airline more than just bad headlines. Meanwhile, Danielle noticed the change in atmosphere. The whispers, the frequent glances toward her row. Something was shifting, and it wasn't just because they were beginning to descend. Jayla, now coloring in a small notebook, looked up. "Mommy, why is everyone looking at us now?" Danielle smiled softly. "They're just paying attention, baby." Sometimes when the truth comes out, people start listening. In the row behind them, Grant pulled out his phone and checked the trending topics. He blinked. "No way," he mumbled. He turned to his seatmate. "It's online already. Someone filmed it. It's blowing up." His seatmate leaned over to see. "Whoa, this is going to be bad for the airline." "Good," Grant replied. "People need to stop thinking they can talk to others like that and just walk away." Down in the crew area, Thomas was pale as he flipped through the flight tablet, pulling up Courtney's record. Her name now had a temporary suspension tag attached. A red notification blinked, "Do not allow to board future flights, pending investigation." He swallowed hard. Corporate was moving faster than he'd ever seen. Laura approached quietly. "We've got a problem beyond this cabin," she said, her voice low and direct. "The video's viral. PR is already drafting a statement. Legal wants contact information for the passenger." Thomas nodded. "Do we tell her now?" "No," Laura said firmly. "We land first, and when we do, she's to be escorted off separately. No announcements, no apologies, just consequences." At the same time, Courtney sat still in her seat, trying to breathe through the rising panic. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her sister text. "Are you serious? What did you do? You're all over TikTok." She didn't reply. She couldn't. Her ears were ringing now, and her hands were clammy. She looked around the cabin like a trapped animal scanning for support, a friendly face, anything. But no one met her eyes. Even the passengers she'd casually joked with earlier were now avoiding her. No one wanted to be seen as siding with her anymore. Back in first class, Danielle finally saw the video on the phone of a woman sitting across the aisle. Their eyes met briefly. The woman nodded with sympathy, turned the screen toward Danielle for a moment, and mouthed, "It's everywhere." Danielle exhaled. Her voice had been turned into a joke. Her presence mocked her child, made to feel small. But now the entire world was watching, and they weren't laughing with Courtney. They were standing with Danielle. A few rows back, Riley refreshed her post again. 58,000 views. Now major news pages had begun to repost it, with headlines like, "Flight attendant humiliates, passenger over, accent instant karma ensues, passenger stays, Calm internet demands action. People were tagging the airline in their tweets. Some called for firings. Others demanded formal apologies. Some simply shared their own stories, making the moment even bigger. As the plane began its final descent, Jayla leaned her head on her mom's shoulder and asked Mommy, "Can we still go to the museum?" after Danielle smiled and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Yes, baby. We'll still go. Nothing's going to stop that." She looked out the window at the gray clouds parting below. There was no applause, no fanfare, just quiet recognition that this moment had shifted something real. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need cameras, didn't beg for attention. She had shown grace where many would have shouted, and now the truth was louder than anything Courtney had ever said. 20 minutes earlier, Courtney had been the one laughing. Now, with every second, her entire career was slipping through her fingers, broadcast for the world to see. The plane touched down with a jolt that made some passengers grip their armrests. The landing itself was smooth, but the tension inside the cabin felt like a wire pulled too tight. Eyes drifted toward the front where Laura was calmly packing up her tablet. At the back, Courtney sat stiff and pale, chewing the inside of her cheek, still clinging to a last shred of hope that maybe somehow this could be undone. Maybe if she just explained herself. Maybe if she just apologized directly, but deep down she already knew. Nothing she said would fix what had been seen by half the internet. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Danielle buckled Jayla's jacket and zipped her backpack. Her movements were quiet, calm. She hadn't looked at Courtney once since the incident, not because she was trying to ignore her, but because she didn't need to look back. She knew how people like that operated loud, when they're mocking, silent when they're caught. And now that the mocking was over, so was Danielle's patience for ever giving it attention again. Up front, the captain opened the cabin door to the jet bridge. Laura stepped forward quickly, signaling to the lead crew member, a uniformed airline representative, and 2 security officers were already waiting just beyond the threshold. It was quiet and professional, no raised voices, no confrontation, just presence, a message. When Laura turned around and made eye contact with Thomas, he gave a short nod. Then the captain made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. For operational reasons, we ask that all passengers in rows 4 and back remain seated while first class exits. We appreciate your cooperation." It was subtle but intentional, designed to isolate the front few rows and to keep Courtney seated until the right time. She noticed her brows furrowed, her eyes darted back and forth. She turned to a nearby flight attendant. "Why can't we deplane yet?" The attendant, clearly instructed ahead of time, said simply, "Well, explain shortly." Courtney turned to look down the aisle. She could see Danielle standing now, holding Jayla's hand, waiting to step off the plane. For a moment, it all became too much. The reality, the silence, the distance between what she thought was harmless fun and what it actually turned into. Danielle walked toward the front, slowly, her daughter beside her. As they approached the door, Laura met her there. "Mrs. Fields," she said gently, "we've already begun the internal process. I want to thank you for staying composed. You didn't deserve what happened today." Danielle nodded once. "I just want to teach my daughter that staying calm doesn't mean staying quiet." Laura smiled. "You did that. You did it perfectly." Jayla glanced up at the 2 women and whispered, "Are we in trouble?" Laura bent down slightly. "No, sweetheart. You're the reason something wrong is getting made right." The mother and daughter stepped off the plane. A corporate escort was already waiting in the terminal to guide them to a lounge where refreshments and a full apology letter would be delivered by a senior executive. Media was being carefully held at bay. But even without cameras in the terminal, the world had already seen enough. Inside the plane, the rest of the passengers stayed quiet as instructed. The energy was strange now, part guilt, part discomfort, part relief that it wasn't them. Courtney tried not to cry, but her eyes burned. She could see security now. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, scrolling mindlessly through more comments, each one another nail in the coffin. Then at last her name was called. "Courtney Ellis, please come to the front with your belongings." Her legs felt heavy as she stood. Every step toward the front of the plane echoed in her chest. When she reached the doorway, Laura met her with the same expression she had worn since the beginning, calm, controlled, and coldly professional. "You are being relieved of duty immediately. You will be escorted off this aircraft and suspended pending investigation. HR will reach out within the next 24 hours. Please turn over your badge and tablet before exiting." Courtney tried to speak. "I didn't mean you did," Laura said, cutting her off. "And now you're accountable for it." With trembling hands, Courtney removed her ID, placed it in Laura's hand, and walked off the plane with security by her side. No one clapped. No one cheered. But the silence that followed said everything. As the rest of the passengers began to disembark, conversations quietly resumed. But they had changed. Some people talked about how fast things had escalated. Others debated whether Courtney had deserved it. But most, whether they said it out loud or not, were thinking the same thing, that maybe mocking someone for their voice, something so personal, so tied to where they come from, isn't just a harmless joke after all. Out in the terminal, Danielle and Jayla waited calmly in a lounge surrounded by polished glass and quiet music. A woman from the airline's corporate office handed Danielle a folder with an apology letter, 2 vouchers for first-class round-trip flights anywhere in the country, and a note that simply read, "Respect starts at the gate. We failed you, we will not fail others." Danielle folded the letter and tucked it into her bag. She didn't need revenge. She had what mattered: her daughter's pride, her own peace, and the knowledge that this time the world had listened. Outside the airport, the gray clouds had given way to streaks of soft sunlight casting long shadows across the terminal windows. Danielle sat with Jayla on a velvet-upholstered bench in the executive lounge, sipping on a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. Jayla had dozed off her head, resting on her mother's lap, one arm wrapped loosely around her stuffed bear. Danielle looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. Despite everything that had happened, the only thing she felt in that moment was relief. Not triumph, not anger, just a quiet, settled breath, like an old weight had been lifted from her chest. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. A message from her assistant popped up first. "Are you okay? I saw the video. It's everywhere. Just say the word and they'll set up a press interview." Danielle stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then another message came in, this time from her university's chancellor. "Danielle, we're proud of how you represented our institution. The board wants to formally recognize your composure and integrity. Let us know how we can support you." Still, she didn't answer. Not yet. Just hours ago, she had been preparing for a simple, quiet arrival in D.C. to give a presentation on the influence of dialect and self-worth in early childhood education. Her speech had nothing to do with racism or public humiliation or viral videos. It was meant to be about celebration, about honoring voices, not fighting to defend them. But now she knew her presence in that room would carry a weight far beyond what she had planned. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, Courtney was being escorted through a side corridor away from the public. The 2 security officers didn't speak much. One of them simply handed her a small envelope with her name written across the front in block letters. Inside was a formal notice of administrative leave, along with a number for a counseling service the airline offered to employees in distress. The irony stung. She'd mocked someone for how they spoke. Someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. And now Courtney was the one who had no words left. As she exited through a staff-only door leading to the lower lot, she noticed a group of employees standing around a phone, watching a clip and whispering. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. Her face was everywhere now. The flight number, the airline logo, her name in the tags, her voice sneering and smug played on repeat for strangers around the world to dissect. The post had crossed 100,000 views by the time she sat in the back seat of the rideshare van that corporate had arranged to take her home. Her hands trembled in her lap. She opened the app again, not out of curiosity this time, but panic. She scrolled through the comments, desperately hoping to find someone, anyone defending her, but it was the same wall of backlash. This is what professionalism looks like. Yikes, how are people still like this in 2025? Shout out to the mom for teaching her daughter how to handle hate with grace. Good fire, her loud and clear. Courtney's own family had started reaching out too. A voicemail from her older brother, Court. What the hell happened? Mom's freaking out. Call me back then, a message from her friend in HR at a different airline girl. Your name is trending. Not in a good way, she sank lower into the seat, eyes burning. Back at the airport lounge, Danielle finally answered her assistant with a short message. Okay, you'll speak, but only when I'm ready. She then opened her notes for her upcoming speech. She stared at the first few lines, clinical, academic, safe. But then she began to rewrite. This time she wrote as a mother, as a woman who had been mocked for sounding like her own grandmother, as a woman who had watched her daughter learn in real time that silence is not weakness and dignity is power. She wrote, an accent is not a mistake to correct. It is history wrapped in syllables. It is memory. It is identity. And when you laugh at someone's voice, what you're really saying is you don't want to hear their story. By the time Jayla woke up, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. She rubbed her eyes and smiled sleepily. Did we miss the museum? She asked Danielle. Looked at the clock. We still have time. Just enough. She helped her daughter up, packed their things, and walked slowly out of the lounge. As they passed through the terminal, more people seemed to recognize her now. A few nodded. One woman approached, gently holding her phone. You're the woman from the video, right? She asked softly. I just wanted to say thank you. You handled that with so much grace. My mom used to get laughed at for how she talked too. Danielle smiled. Thank you for saying that. Your mom's voice mattered. And then they continued on hand in hand toward the exit, two passengers who had boarded the plane quietly and were now walking away from it with the world finally listening. But far beyond the airport walls, the real noise was only beginning. The video had now been picked up by major outlets. News headlines were being drafted, commentators were already planning panels, and the airline. They were preparing for a public response that would include more than just a statement. They were about to change policy, and it all started because a little girl asked, why is she talking like that? And a mother decided the answer wasn't going to be silence. By the time Danielle and Jayla reached the museum, the sky had turned a dusty orange. The city lights flickered to life as twilight settled in, casting soft glows over the sidewalks. The museum entrance was nearly empty, just a few tourists and evening visitors. It was quiet, peaceful, just what they needed. Inside, they wandered through the exhibits, slowly taking their time. Jayla paused at a sculpture shaped like a wave, reading the small plaque beneath it. Danielle watched, her heart full but heavy, thinking about how her daughter had already seen so much more than a child should have to at that age. Not just today, but in general. The side eyes, the comments, the surprise on people's faces when Danielle used long words or wore a blazer with heels, the constant pressure to sound right, to speak properly, as if their words had to be translated to be accepted. Jayla turned to her. Mommy, do I have an accent too? Danielle crouched beside her. Yes, baby, and it's beautiful. It sounds like where we come from, like your grandma, like me. It's your voice. Never let anyone tell you it's wrong. Jayla nodded, slowly smiling. Then she wrapped her arms around her mom's neck. I like how we talk. It sounds warm. Danielle held her close. It's because it is. They walked on together, the echo of their footsteps trailing softly behind them in the museum halls. Danielle didn't check her phone again for nearly an hour. When she finally did, she found 3 missed calls from the airline's corporate team. A voicemail from a senior director asking if she would consider joining their internal advisory board on inclusivity training. A second message followed minutes later from the university where she taught. They wanted her to expand her curriculum to build a training module that would be offered to every incoming freshman. Her quiet resistance had rippled far beyond the plane, but things weren't as quiet elsewhere. Back at the airline's corporate office, meetings had been called late into the evening. Executives gathered in video conferences, watching the viral clip for the 20th time, analyzing every word. Every pause, Courtney's face on every screen, her exaggerated mimicry, the stunned expression on Danielle's face, and the child Jayla's soft voice had struck a nerve with viewers in ways no adult ever could. People weren't just angry. They were emotional, outraged, yes, but also touched. One executive leaned forward in the meeting. We're not just dealing with an employee issue here. This has turned into a public trust issue. People are asking us, what does your airline stand for? Another added, "We need more than an apology. We need to show this won't happen again." The communications team prepared a draft statement, but the CEO himself rejected it. Too polished, too corporate. "We're going to say it plain." He leaned forward and dictated the new headline himself. "To Dr. Danielle Fields and every passenger who's ever felt unheard, we failed you, but we won't ignore it. Change is coming." It was simple, direct. And within the hour, the statement went live across all platforms. The post exploded. Hundreds of thousands of shares. Celebrity retweets, public figures, and activists praising Danielle for her poise. More importantly, thousands of ordinary people commented with their own stories. Times they'd been mocked, laughed at, overlooked. A truck driver who said he was ashamed of his drawl for years. A Haitian immigrant who remembered being laughed at in middle school. A teacher who said she'd been warned not to sound too Southern during interviews. The hashtag #MyVoiceMatters began trending globally. And while all of this unfolded, Courtney sat alone in her apartment, staring at her darkened phone screen. No messages now, no notifications. No one checking in anymore, not even her supervisor. Her email had been temporarily suspended, her airline badge locked out of the system, her social media accounts deactivated after hundreds of people tagged her name in angry posts. Her voicemail full. She hadn't left the apartment since being dropped off. The silence was louder than anything she had heard on the plane. At first she tried to write a statement, something to explain, but nothing she typed sounded right. Nothing erased what was already everywhere. She opened the viral video one more time. She couldn't even watch herself fully. The sound of her voice, the smug tone, the laughter, it felt like someone else. But it wasn't, that was her. That was the version of herself that had felt untouchable. She had laughed without thought, acted without kindness, and now she was learning too. Late that the people she'd laughed at had been listening the whole time. She closed the video, shut off the lights, and sat in the dark. The glow of the city outside, the only thing moving. Back at the museum, Jayla tugged her mom's arm. "Can we come back here again next time?" Danielle smiled, finally feeling a bit of the day's weight lift. "Yes, we can. Next time, well, come just to enjoy it." Jayla grinned and squeezed her hand. Danielle looked down at her daughter's bright face and knew no matter how many headlines were written, how many posts were shared, the most important thing had already happened. Her daughter had seen her stand tall with quiet strength. She had seen that you don't have to raise your voice to rise above hate. That lesson would last a lifetime. By the next morning, the story had reached nearly every corner of the internet. News networks were broadcasting segments with titles like "A Voice That Broke the Silence in Passenger's Accent." Mocked now, she's leading a movement. Talk shows featured experts dissecting the video frame by frame. Editorials appeared in major newspapers about language discrimination and cultural bias, referencing Danielle by name. Dr. Danielle Fields, a linguist, a mother, and now a reluctant symbol of quiet resistance. But Danielle wasn't reading any of it. She and Jayla had checked into a small boutique hotel in the city that morning. The airline had offered a luxury suite at a 5-star hotel, along with private transportation and even a personal assistant for convenience. Danielle declined. She didn't want attention. She wanted space. She wanted time with her daughter. She wanted quiet. She spent the morning walking through a small farmer's market with Jayla, picking up pastries and fresh fruit. People stared. Yes, some approached with kind words, a few with tears. One woman with streaks of gray in her hair simply touched Danielle's hand and whispered, "Thank you for holding your head high. You gave us all something to be proud of." Danielle smiled, thanked her, and moved on. She appreciated the kindness, but it also reminded her of something heavy. How many people had been carrying the same burden? Just in silence, Jayla didn't quite understand what was happening in the world outside their little moment. She just knew people were nicer than usual, that her mom was in the news, and that everyone wanted to talk to her. But she also noticed how her mom kept her answers short, how her smiles didn't always reach her eyes. "Are you tired, Mommy?" she asked as they sat on a bench in the park nearby. A little, Danielle said honestly. Because of that lady on the plane, Danielle looked at her daughter and hesitated. Not just her. It's when people act like your voice is a problem. It doesn't just hurt. It sticks with you. It makes you question things you shouldn't have. I've been trying to let it go for years, Jayla thought for a moment. I don't want to let my voice go, you won't. Danielle said gently. I won't let you. In another part of the city, far from the quiet of the Park airline, executives were in the middle of a live press conference. The CEO stood behind a podium with the company logo beside him. He looked somber, serious, not rehearsed. We want to speak directly to our customers, our employees, and our communities. What happened on Flight 736 was wrong. It wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a sign that we have work to do, work we are now starting today. He went on to outline a new internal policy that was already being rolled out. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all flight crew. A new hotline for passengers to report verbal misconduct. And most importantly, the formation of an internal advisory board made up of both airline staff and external advocate, including educators like Danielle. Reporters fired off questions about the employee involved. Courtney, the CEO, was clear she has been terminated effective immediately. This was not her first incident involving inappropriate behavior, but it will be her last. That quote made headlines by the hour. Meanwhile, Courtney sat alone in her small apartment, scrolling through job boards with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Fear. She had always assumed she was safe. She'd been with the airline for nearly a decade, knew the rules, played the game. But what she didn't know, or maybe had chosen to ignore, was that some games aren't played anymore. The world had changed and she hadn't paid attention. Her inbox was filled with rejections from recruiters who had seen her name or face, her voice. Her LinkedIn was flooded with comments, her phone didn't ring, and the few friends who had defended her at first had gone silent after watching the video themselves. She had become what she never thought she'd be, the example. But this story was about her anymore. It never really was. That afternoon, Danielle sat in her hotel room reviewing her newly rewritten speech. It had changed completely in toneless theory, more truth, less citation, more story. The opening line now read, "There is no correct way to sound intelligent. Intelligence wears every accent, every dialect, every rhythm. To judge a voice is to ignore a story, and every story matters." She saved the document and closed her laptop. Her speech would be delivered in front of hundreds tomorrow, but for now she wanted to be present. To live in the quiet with her daughter, who was sitting on the floor playing with a sticker book. Humming softly, Danielle joined her, lying beside her on the carpet, head resting on a pillow. "Are we still going to the zoo tomorrow?" Jayla asked without looking up. Danielle smiled. "Absolutely, but only if you let me pick the first animal." Jayla giggled. "Deal." Outside the window, the city kept moving. Stories were still being told. Posts were still being shared. Debates were still being had. But inside that room, it was just a mother and her daughter, two voices that refused to be quiet, two stories that could not be erased. And the world, whether it liked it or not, was finally learning to listen. Morning light spilled into the hotel room in thin golden rays. Jayla stirred under the covers. First blinking sleep from her eyes as the city stirred outside. Danielle was already awake, sitting near the window, wrapped in a shawl and sipping her coffee slowly. Her laptop sat open on the desk behind her, but she hadn't touched it yet. Today was the day of her keynote speech, one she'd given versions of many times before, but never like this. Never with millions of eyes watching. Never with people waiting to hear not just her expertise, but her experience. Jayla climbed out of bed and tiptoed over to her mother. "Are you nervous?" she asked, nestling against her side. Danielle nodded a little. "But you're the smartest person I know." Danielle smiled, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and said, "Thank you, baby. That helps more than you know." She took a deep breath. Outside that hotel window, journalists were already gathered across the street. Her face had appeared on 3 morning shows already. One headline read, "Grace Under Pressure. The woman who made the skies listen." Another simply called her the voice they couldn't silence. The university auditorium was packed before noon. Faculty, students, reporters, and guests filled the seats, many of them holding printed programs featuring Danielle's name in bold. She arrived with Jayla, both wearing soft blue. She didn't want to appear untouchable. She wanted to appear real, because that was what this had always been about. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd quieted almost instantly. The lights were warm but not blinding, and the microphone adjusted to her height with a small mechanical hum. She paused for a moment, taking in the room. Her daughter sat in the front row, legs crossed, eyes wide with admiration. Just behind her sat members of the university board, senior executives from the airline, and advocates from various civil rights organizations who had flown in after the video went viral. Danielle began softly. No theatrics, no rehearsed gestures. I never wanted to be a headline. I never wanted to be a symbol. I wanted to be a mother, a teacher, and a person who helps others find the power in their voice. But when you're born with an accent, people think is wrong. You don't always get to choose what kind of attention you receive. Her voice held steady as she told the story, not as the world had seen it, but as she had lived it. How her accent had been commented on since childhood. How she had practiced enunciating differently in college just to be taken seriously. How even now, with a doctorate and a decorated career, a single moment of mockery could still feel like a wound. But then she turned to the audience, her eyes scanning the faces. And still am grateful, not for the insult, but for the truth it revealed. Because what happened on that flight isn't rare. It's just rarely caught on camera. And every day people are made to feel small for sounding like their parents, their towns, their stories. The room was so silent, you could hear the hum of the stage lights. She continued, "This isn't about canceling anyone. This is about confronting a kind of quiet bias that hides in jokes and raised eyebrows in the way people say, 'Oh, you're so articulate,' like it's a surprise." Heads nodded throughout the auditorium, some slowly, some with visible emotion. On one side of the room, an older black woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A young Latina student looked down at her notebook, writing furiously. Danielle closed with a message, not of anger, but of responsibility. "If my daughter remembers anything about this, I want her to remember that her voice is hers to own, not to edit for someone else's comfort. And if you've ever felt ashamed of how you speak, I want you to know, you don't need to change a thing. It's the world that needs to listen better." The room stood a full standing ovation, not out of politeness, but because the truth had hit home. Danielle took a humble step back, nodding once, and then made her way down the stage stairs. Jayla ran into her arms, hugging her tightly. "You were amazing," she whispered. Danielle hugged her back. "You helped me be backstage." A representative from the airline waited holding a small folder. "Dr. Fields," she began, "we're establishing a scholarship in your name. It's for students pursuing degrees in speech pathology and cultural studies, and we're also launching a training initiative for all flight staff. You'll have full creative input." Danielle blinked, surprised, overwhelmed, but she stayed composed. "Thank you," she said. "That means something, but make sure it's not just about me. It needs to serve the kids who haven't been heard yet." "It will," the rep replied. "We promise." Meanwhile, at Courtney's former apartment complex across the city, a moving truck pulled into the lot. Her name had been taken off the tenant directory. She'd been evicted 2 days after her termination. With no job, no savings, and no backing, she had left the city, quietly disappearing without fanfare. She left behind more than an address. She left behind her old identity. She would have to rebuild somewhere else, carrying the echo of her own laughter, the moment that changed everything. Back at the university, Danielle was surrounded by students, journalists, faculty, and strangers who just wanted to say thank you. She spoke with each one as long as she could, listening as they shared stories of being teased, overlooked, interrupted. She heard stories in Southern accents, Caribbean tones, Midwestern drawls, and clipped immigrant voices, each one filled with memory and pride. When the auditorium finally cleared out and the cameras were put away, she and Jayla walked out into the late afternoon sun. Danielle removed her heels and carried them in her hand. Jayla skipped ahead, laughing light on her feet. "You want to take the long way home?" Jayla called back. Danielle smiled. "Yeah, let's walk. Let's take our time." Because this time they weren't rushing to catch up to anyone else's pace. This time they were walking in a world that had finally paused long enough to hear them. The long walk home was quiet in the best way. No reporters, no interruptions, no questions asked from curious passersby. Just the steady rhythm of feet on pavement, and the occasional sound of city birds chirping between buildings. Jayla skipped ahead, pausing every so often to look at colorful chalk drawings on the sidewalk or point at small dogs pulling on their leashes. Danielle followed with her heels in one hand, the other hand shading her eyes from the low sun. She felt lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because she finally wasn't carrying it alone. They stopped at a corner cafe and sat at an outdoor table sharing a slice of banana bread and sipping lemonade. Jayla told a long, winding story about a girl in her class who got in trouble for talking too much during math. Danielle listened closely, smiling and nodding, giving her daughter her full attention. She didn't want Jayla to feel like the world was too big or too loud. Not today, not when she'd already had to be braver than any child should. A group of college students nearby were whispering excitedly and glancing over at their table. One of them approached hesitantly, a girl with pink-tipped braids and a lanyard around her neck. "Dr. Fields," she asked almost shyly, "I just wanted to say, your speech changed something in me. I used to hate my voice. I tried so hard to sound like other people just to fit in. But hearing you today, it felt like permission to just be Danielle." Placed her hand gently over the girl's. "You never needed permission, but I'm glad you took it anyway." The girl smiled, tears forming at the corners of her eyes, then returned to her table. Jayla leaned in and whispered, "You help so many people." Mommy Danielle squeezed her hand. "So do you, sweetheart. You just don't know it yet." Later that evening, in the quiet of their hotel room, Jayla fell asleep, curled against her mother's side, hugging her stuffed bear tightly. Danielle lay beside her phone, in hand watching the numbers climb again. The video now had over 8 million views. She scrolled through the top comments. "This woman's composure is a masterclass in dignity." The child's face. "The way she looked at her mom," I cried. "We need to have this conversation in every school, every office, every airport." Danielle turned the phone over and let it rest on the nightstand. She didn't need more noise tonight. The world had said enough. Across the city in a quiet home office, the CEO of the airline reread Danielle's speech transcript. He had printed it out and underlined 2 lines in red. "To judge a voice is to ignore a story. It's the world that needs to listen better." He looked up from the paper and turned to his assistant. "Make sure every new employee reads this on day 1. Not just the flight crews, everyone from the front desk to finance?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "And start planning a national campaign. I want her words on posters in every terminal, her voice over our training modules. If we're going to talk about values, we better show them." Meanwhile, in another part of the country, a high school debate coach printed Danielle's speech and handed it to her students. "Read this," she said. "Not just for the language, for the meaning. This is how you speak when you have something real to say." In the small town where Danielle had grown up, her former elementary school principal was preparing to hang a framed newspaper clipping in the hallway. "Former student changes the conversation about voice and identity." The headline read, "The principal called it a reminder to staff and students alike. Never underestimate the quiet kids." The ripples were everywhere now, and not just online, not just in corporate offices or academic spaces, in kitchens, living rooms, classrooms, barbershops, and back porches. People were talking differently, listening differently. Parents were rethinking how they corrected their children's speech. Teachers were revisiting their classroom tone. Recruiters were questioning the way they described professionalism in their job postings. Danielle had not set out to spark a movement. She had simply boarded a plane, answered a question, and refused to let someone else shrink her. And somehow, that decision had reached people who had never even heard her speak. The next morning she woke before Jayla. The sky outside was pale and soft. She made coffee quietly and sat again at the window. This time she opened her laptop and began typing something new. Not a speech, not an article, a book proposal. The working title, Our Voices Finding Pride in the Sound of Who We Are. She had resisted the idea for years. Writing a book had always felt too personal, too open. But now she realized that her silence wouldn't protect anyone. Not herself, not her daughter, not the kids she worked with every day. Sharing her story wasn't just for visibility, it was for power, for healing, for progress. She wrote 3 chapters in one sitting. By the time Jayla woke up, rubbing her eyes and stretching under the hotel duvet, Danielle had already typed over 4,000 words. She closed her laptop, smiled, and reached out. "Good morning, baby. Want to get pancakes before the zoo?" Jayla grinned, with extra strawberries. Danielle stood stretched and looked around the room that had become their temporary home. It didn't matter where they were anymore. The world knew her name now, not for scandal, not for gossip, but for truth. And she wasn't done speaking yet. A week later, back in their home city, Danielle and Jayla returned to the familiar comforts of their modest neighborhood. The brick house with the chipped white fence, the porch swing that creaked when you leaned too far back, the sound of neighborhood kids riding their bikes up and down the sidewalk, yelling each other's names, it was all still there. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Neighbors waved as they pulled into the driveway, some with knowing smiles, others with shy nods. One elderly man from 3 houses down paused while trimming his hedges and gave a proud thumb. "Sup," Danielle nodded back. She didn't need to ask what it meant. Inside the house, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window onto the same table where Danielle had spent years preparing lessons, editing research papers, and organizing her lectures. But now that table was piled with unopened mail, handwritten letters, cards from strangers, thick manila envelopes from schools asking her to come speak to their students. There were even drawings from children across the country, stick figures labeled Dr. Danielle and Jayla, sometimes standing in front of a plane, sometimes on a stage with a microphone. Danielle opened a few at a time, careful not to overwhelm herself. One was from a woman in Georgia who wrote, "Thank you for making me feel like I don't need to hide my voice anymore. I've avoided speaking up at work for years. Not anymore." Another came from a school counselor in Chicago. "I've used your story in my classroom this week. Kids opened up about being teased for their accents. You started a conversation I couldn't. Each word felt like a piece of something she hadn't known she was building, something far beyond her academic work, something human and raw." Danielle wasn't just being thanked for surviving an uncomfortable flight. She was being recognized for transforming that moment into a mirror, one that forced people to see how much harm could be packed into a single laugh, a single sentence. In the following days, invitations flooded in, podcasts, news shows, panels. Most of them offered payment, some promised huge platforms. She said no to nearly all of them. She didn't want to become a face people passed around for clicks. She wanted her words to be handled with care. And more importantly, she still had a life to live. Jayla had school to return to, and Danielle had papers to grade and students waiting for her in her own classroom. Her university offered to relieve her from teaching duties for the semester, but she declined. "They don't need me less because my name is trending," she told the dean. "They need me more." Back in her classroom, she walked in on the first day of the new term. To a long silence, every student stood. Some clapped, others simply nodded. Not out of pity, but out of something else. Respect that had been there before, but now had weight. Danielle smiled and asked them all to sit. "We've got work to do," she said, and launched into the day's lesson like she always had. But her office hours started looking different. Students began dropping in, not to talk about class materials, but about themselves. A young man with a heavy Appalachian drawl shared how he'd been told for years to clean up his voice. A girl who had emigrated from Jamaica asked if it was okay to stop code switching when she felt safe. One student, barely audible, confessed, "I almost changed my major because I didn't think people like me could teach." Danielle listened to each story with the patience of someone who had lived it. And slowly her role expanded beyond professor. She was becoming a sounding board, a reminder, a living example of what it looked like to succeed without shedding your sound. Meanwhile, Jayla returned to her second-grade classroom where her teacher pulled her aside and said gently, "We're so proud of your mom, and we're proud of you too." Jayla smiled wide, then walked to her desk with her head just a little higher. In the days that followed, Danielle began work on the foundation she'd been asked to lead. The airline had officially partnered with her to build an education initiative for flight crews across the country, focusing on cultural respect and verbal bias. She was given full control, curriculum trainers, rollout timeline. The first meetings were already scheduled. She titled the program, the accent of respect. The airline also announced that starting immediately, their staff onboarding would include modules inspired by Danielle's work. Posters bearing her quotes were printed and placed in every break room across the company. One in particular stood out. Every accent is a story. Are you listening or are you judging? The impact was fast. Flight attendants posted pictures standing next to the posters, captioning them with notes like, "We hear you now," or "Learning, growing, respecting." Danielle appreciated the gesture, but she also knew real change would take time. Policies were easy. Culture was harder. Still, she'd lit a match in a room that had gone dim long ago, and the flame was catching. While all this unfolded, Courtney remained silent. After the termination, she disappeared from the public eye entirely. No statements, no reactivating her accounts. Some said she moved back to her hometown. Others claimed she'd taken a job at a small regional airline under a different name. No one really knew. Danielle didn't care to speculate. She wasn't waiting for an apology. What she needed had already happened. The world had acknowledged something real, and for once, people were paying attention, not to how she said something, but to what she was saying. Late one evening, after tucking Jayla into bed, Danielle sat once again at her kitchen table. The manuscript was nearly finished. Her publisher had already sent a draft cover. Her editor wanted a dedication. She stared at the blinking cursor for a while before finally typing, "For Jayla, may your voice never shrink to fit someone else's comfort." She hit save, leaned back, and exhaled. A single moment on a plane had changed everything. But this wasn't the story of a viral clip. It was the story of a mother and daughter, a lesson passed through generations, and a voice unapologetic, unedited, and finally undeniably heard. As the weeks continued, the momentum didn't fade. It only widened. Danielle's story had begun with a moment, but it had evolved into something much harder to dismiss. What started as a viral video became a broader reckoning, not just with how people speak, but with how society defines professionalism, intelligence, and respect. In city libraries, book clubs began adding our voices, Danielle's soon-to-be-published memoir, to their reading lists before it even hit the shelves. Teachers printed excerpts from her speech and taped them to classroom walls. Radio hosts replayed audio clips from her keynote, while callers phoned in to share similar experiences. Being mocked in the workplace, being told their voice wasn't clear enough, or being asked, "Where are you really from?" Even comedy stages, usually home to free-for-all, mockery began to shift. A well-known comedian paused mid-set. One night shook his head after imitating a customer's voice and said into the mic, "Actually, you know what? I watched that woman's video, and I think I'm done making jokes that punch down." Her voice sounded more powerful than anything I've ever said up here. The audience applauded. That moment was shared online too, and it drew comments from people who'd never thought to question what they laughed at. But for Danielle, life wasn't glamorous, not behind the scenes. She still dealt with grocery store lines, traffic emails, overdue bills, and the occasional exhaustion that came from simply being known. People didn't always approach with kindness. A few questioned her, accused her of blowing the situation out of proportion. Others rolled their eyes, thinking she was capitalizing on a moment that wasn't that serious. It was just a joke, they said online. She didn't need to ruin that girl's life. Danielle read some of those comments, not all. She didn't respond to any of them. She had lived the moment, felt the heat in her chest as a uniformed woman laughed at her. Not because she was funny, but because she dared to speak in her natural voice. She had watched her daughter witness that humiliation. She didn't need to justify her reaction to people who never would have understood the weight of that look, that tone, that public belittling. That kind of experience didn't need explanation, it needed acknowledgement. So she focused on the real impact. She finalized the structure of the airline's training program and led the first virtual session herself. Over 600 employees logged in: flight attendants, pilots, gate agents, customer service reps. She started the session not with slides, but with a question. Tell me a time someone made you feel small because of how you spoke. The chat flooded with stories, some lighthearted, some painful Southern accents, immigrant tones, stutter speech delays. Even seasoned staff admitted they had changed how they spoke over time, just to be accepted. Danielle didn't interrupt. She let the stories speak for themselves. Then she asked a second question. How often have you judged someone else before they even finished a sentence? There was more silence in the chat this time. But honesty, too, that was the beginning of change. Not policies, not PR campaigns. Honest reflection. After the session, the airline's HR director called her. "We've never had participation numbers like that." She said, "You've created something that's going to last." Danielle thanked her, but she didn't celebrate. She didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't about winning. It was about pulling something ugly into the light, so people couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. Meanwhile, Jayla had become something of a quiet celebrity at school. Her classmates treated her like royalty for the first few days, crowding around her at recess, asking what it was like to be on TV. Jayla would just shrug and say, "It was weird." But later, when her teacher asked the class to write an essay on someone they admired, Jayla wrote about her mom. She stood in front of the class and read her paper aloud, her little voice clear and confident. "My mom didn't yell. She didn't get angry. She just stayed calm. She told me that our voices matter even when people laugh at them. I think that makes her brave. I want to be brave like that too." Danielle cried reading it at home. And while the news cycle moved on, as it always does, her message did not. Her book's pre-orders broke expectations. A documentary filmmaker reached out asking to include her story in a series about everyday resistance. And university departments across the country requested guest lectures. Still, Danielle only accepted what fit within her values. She never wanted her face to outshine her message. She wanted the lesson to remain loudest. Even with the spotlight still trailing her, Danielle's days often looked normal. She walked Jayla to school. She graded essays late at night. She responded to emails with one hand while stirring a pot on the stove with the other. Her life hadn't become easier, just more visible. But visibility had a cost. And while she didn't regret the path she'd walked, she also knew the spotlight could turn cold in an instant. That evening, she and Jayla sat on the porch swing, watching the sky shift from orange to indigo. Crickets chirped in the bushes. Porch lights blinked on one by one across the street. "Do you think people will forget what happened?" Jayla asked, curled beside her with a bowl of grapes. "Maybe," Danielle answered. "Some will. That's how the world works. But the ones who needed to hear it the most, they won't forget, and you won't either." "That's what matters," Jayla nodded, thoughtful. "I told my friend today that she didn't have to talk like anyone else just to be liked. I said she sounded just right." Danielle smiled, her heart full. "That's all I ever hoped you'd learn." They rocked gently, the swing creaking beneath them as the stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Quiet moments like this reminded Danielle what all of this had been for. Not the headlines, not the clapping, not the emails or the programs, or even the book. It was for this, a little girl growing up with no doubt that her voice mattered, that she never needed to shrink herself to fit someone else's idea of acceptable. That was the real victory, and it would echo far beyond that flight. Weeks passed, and while the media slowly shifted its spotlight elsewhere, as it always does, the seeds Danielle had planted continued to take root in quiet, meaningful ways. Her story was no longer viral in the flashy, trending sense. It had transitioned into something deeper, part of everyday conversations, part of school lessons, workplace discussions, and kitchen table talks across the country. It had become the kind of story people referred to by feeling rather than fame. "Remember that woman on the flight, the one who stayed calm when they mocked her? Yeah, I think about her sometimes. Changed how I speak to people." Danielle never aimed to be remembered. She simply wanted to be respected, and for others like her, to be heard without needing to fight for it. But there was no denying it. Her name had become part of something larger than herself, and slowly people began building on what she started. At a university in Portland, a graduate student developed a thesis based on linguistic discrimination in service industry, using Danielle's experience as the foundation. In Chicago, a public high school launched an accent week, encouraging students to present stories, poems, and speeches in their natural dialects with no corrections or apologies. In Atlanta, a corporate trainer cited Danielle's case in a seminar titled "Respecting Difference Without Diluting Identity." Her words had made it into textbooks, hallway posters, training manuals, and classroom icebreakers. And still, Danielle remained grounded in the life she had always loved, simple, steady, rich in purpose. Every Sunday she visited her mother's house, a quiet place in the countryside, with faded paint and wildflowers along the fence line. Her mother, Evelyn, was a retired school teacher, sharp as ever and proud beyond measure. But she also worried. "You still watching your health?" she'd ask every visit. "You're doing a lot out there." "I'm okay," Mama Danielle would say, "just taking it one step at a time." Evelyn poured sweet tea into mason jars and said softly, "You know when you were a little girl you used to whisper when strangers were around? I used to tell you not to hide your voice. And now here you are making sure nobody else hides theirs either." Danielle smiled. "Guess I listened more than I let on." Back at home, Jayla was thriving in her quiet way. She'd started writing stories, short, colorful ones, filled with confident girls. Animals that spoke in rhyme, and sometimes moms who stood up for what was right. Her teacher sent Danielle a note saying Jayla had become more vocal in class, eager to read aloud, unafraid of her own tone or cadence. "She sounds like she knows her voice is important." The note read, Danielle saved it in a folder labeled Jayla's Light. That folder had grown thick one evening while preparing dinner. Danielle received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. Dr. Fields, a soft, nervous voice, asked, "This is Melanie. I work in airline compliance. I used to work with Courtney. I just wanted to say, I saw everything. I didn't speak up that day. I froze. I've been ashamed of that, but I want you to know what you said. What you did, it changed how I see my job. I lead a team now, and I start every staff meeting by reminding them, you don't know someone's story just by hearing their voice." There was a pause. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything when it mattered most." Danielle replied gently, "It still matters now." When she hung up, she sat in silence for a moment, then looked at the kitchen clock. The rice needed checking. The moment passed and life moved on, but a small piece of healing had just taken place in the background of a normal Tuesday night that became the pattern. Life didn't turn into a movie. There were no red carpets or dramatic endings, just steady waves of change showing up in everyday places. A bus driver greeting passengers more warmly. A nurse introducing herself to a patient in Spanish, not apologizing for her accent. A hiring manager rethinking why certain voices made them hesitate. Courtney, on the other hand, remained largely out of public view. She had not given any interviews, had not posted online. No statements, no defenses. But through quiet channels, Danielle later heard that Courtney had enrolled in a local community college, taking courses in social psychology and communication. One of her classmates, unaware of the connection, mentioned the flight incident during a class discussion. Some people learned the hard way. They had said Courtney had stayed quiet then too, but she listened. Maybe she was finally starting to. Danielle didn't dwell on it. She didn't wish her harm. What she wanted, what she always wanted, was for people to reflect, to grow. She didn't need revenge. She needed change. One night after Jayla had gone to sleep, Danielle sat on the edge of her bed. Thumbing through an old photo album, she found a picture of herself as a young girl, maybe 8, sitting on her grandmother's lap. Her mouth was open in mid-laughter, her head tilted back, her small hands gripping her grandma's apron. No fear, no hesitation in her voice, then just joy. She stared at it for a while, then tucked it into a frame on her nightstand. The world had tried to shape her voice into something smaller, softer, more acceptable. But she had resisted, and now so many others were resisting too. The next morning she woke up to a new email. A publisher from overseas wanted to translate her book into 3 languages. Danielle smiled and typed a reply. "Yes, please. Let those voices be heard too." Because that was always the point. Not just her story, not just her accent, but every voice, given the dignity to speak without fear, and finally the chance to be heard. Months had passed since that day on the plane, and while the initial firestorm had cooled, what remained was something stronger than outrage foundation. Danielle's story had become part of a wider shift, a quiet but undeniable movement to reframe how society values voices that don't conform to polished standards. No longer a trending topic, but a lasting lesson. Jayla now proudly reading chapter books aloud at the kitchen table. No longer hesitated before speaking in front of others. She didn't ask if she sounded right. She just spoke with confidence, with clarity, with a joy that only comes from knowing you're allowed to exist exactly as you are. Danielle, too, had grown. Her days remained busy, with classes, speaking engagements, and writing. But it was the smallest things that filled her, with the most pride: students staying after lectures to say thank you, emails from strangers saying her words gave them courage, and mothers writing to tell her their children were no longer ashamed to speak up in school. Her voice had echoed into boardrooms, classrooms, and quiet conversations across dinner tables. And yet through it all, she stayed rooted in one simple truth. She had never tried to be a hero. She had only tried to hold her dignity when someone tried to take it away. In the end, that's what made her unforgettable. And now it's your turn. Maybe you've been laughed at for how you speak. Maybe you've been told to fix your voice or talk proper just to be accepted. Or maybe without realizing it, you were the one doing the mocking. Wherever you are in that story, you have a choice now: to listen better, to speak kinder, to honor every voice, not just the loudest or the most polished, but the real ones, the honest ones, the ones that carry family culture, struggle, and pride. So if this story moved you even just a little, don't let it stop here. Leave a comment below. Has anyone ever judged your voice or someone you love? Share your story. Like this video if you believe every accent has a place at the table. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel, because we're not done telling stories that matter. This isn't just a video. It's a reminder your voice is not a mistake. It's history, it's identity, and it's yours. Say it, own it, and never let anyone silence it again. Thanks for watching.